Hey guys, welcome back. Hope you're doing well. And in this video, I'll be walking through a raw file edit and showing 5 different things that you can do that work on every single photo. Now, the nice thing is these are pretty simple, straightforward things. It's primarily though just about control and taking your time and planning how you want to edit your photo. Let me show you. I've got a file here. This is a raw file, and I'm going to start and develop raw. And that's tip number 1 is I always start with a raw file. So be sure that you shoot in raw because you just get a richer data set. It gives you a bit more flexibility in post to really kind of fix things, adjust things, move things around, that sort of thing. So I'm going to start with auto distortion correction, which I think does a pretty good job there. And then I'm going to go ahead and close that. And I'm going to go over here, and I always activate the J key just to give me an idea of what areas might be blown out highlights and what areas might be complete black. You can see I've got some complete black down here because that is covered up in blue. So I am going to go ahead and raise the exposure a little bit. I go about 1/4 of a stop here. I do add a small bit of smart contrast. I'm pulling down the highlights about a -20 or so. And then I'm pulling up the shadows about the same, about a +20. So overall, my photo is looking a lot better. I am going to actually lift the blacks and the whites in this case. Often I'll do them kind of in opposite directions, but in this case, I'm ending up lifting both. I still don't have any really red overlays except a little bit right there, and that was the moon, but everything else looks fine. Even these shadow areas doesn't really bother me, and we'll do some more things around that here in a moment. Now, the only other thing to do is I'm going to go check on this de-vignetting. So I'm going to hit the J key. I feel like there's a little bit of vignetting here in the raw file, so I'm going to go ahead and grab the de-vignette slider, and I end up going to about a 60, and that's just fixing a little bit of the darkness around the edges, which is the vignetting that the tool is referring to. But starting with a raw file that looked like that, I'm now there, and I just think it looks so much better. Having that raw file is the best tip to start with. Always start with a raw file. And my second tip is really, because I always think of editing light first and then detail and then color, I'll always go to super contrast second, simply because it's just an amazing tool for helping you kind of refine the light in your image. And usually what I do is I go about 1/3 or 1/4 of the way on each of these 3 tonal areas, and then I come in and adjust the balance until I get something that basically looks the way I want it to look in the photo. I mean, this is a light adjustment, so every photo is going to be different, of course. And I generally just move these around and experiment until I get to something that I like. In this case, I went from there to there, so I kind of evened out a little bit of that shadow down below. Not a huge difference in the photo, but I do think the photo looks a little bit better. Again, before and after. So that's tip number 2. As you continue to think about the light, super contrast, I think, is the best second tool to use when you're editing after Develop Raw. Now, the third tip I want to talk about is basically dodging and burning, for lack of a better term. It is all about using tools to manage the light. I talked about doing light first in Develop. I worked on light and super contrast. And even though detail and color tend to follow in my sort of flow, my workflow, light's a common theme. It continues throughout the entire process. And in this case, what I'm going to do is go get a mask. And this is a good time to pause and tell you that I'm building a masking course for Luminar Neo. It's just about finished. I've made a lot of videos. It's multiple hours of content just about masking in Luminar Neo. That's going to be coming really soon. I mentioned that in my last video. And if you would like to learn more, join my newsletter. Just subscribe at that link down below. I'll be announcing that really soon, but I dive into all aspects of the 4 major masking tools in Luminar Neo, which is the brush mask, the linear gradient, the radial gradient, and mask AI. It's a massive course. I'm excited about it. I think you're going to get a ton out of it. So if you're interested, check that out. But that's a thing that I use. I find myself using masks on every photo these days. And I'm going to use it now because it's a great way to control the light. I'm going to start with this linear gradient, and I'm going to drag it up from the bottom because I want to work on that foreground area. And I'm going to lift the exposure a little bit. I go to about a 65 or something like that. And then I also end up adding some smart contrast. And here I go to about 30. So you can kind of see the before and the after. It's much brighter, but I didn't brighten everything because I added back that contrast. And that's the beauty of using Develop for these kind of moves with the mask. Not just is the mask helping me contain or control where my edit goes, but having multiple tools like exposure and contrast really gives me a good way to kind of manage that light and make it look the way that I feel like it needs to look in this photo. The other great thing about using Develop is I can come in here with the temperature adjustment, and I'm going to bump the warmth up about 2, and I go to about an 18 or 19 on the tint. So if you look at that section down below where I use the linear gradient, there it is before, and there it is now. It just looks massively different. And now that I'm done with that, I'm going to go ahead and close Develop, but I'm going to use it again. So once again, I'm going to get Develop, and this time I'm going to do a mask in the upper part of the photo, and I'm going to use a linear gradient again. And I like to use a linear gradient with a pretty broad gradient zone. The gradient zone is really this area in between the upper line and the lower line where the effect starts to fade, essentially. And even though I'm adjusting the sky, I'll often use a linear gradient instead of Mask AI simply because it's got a gradient. The Mask AI tool does not have a gradient. It's a hard edge, and while it'll go around these sticks and around that building, it still has a really hard edge, which means sometimes you get a little bit of a halo, and there's not a really great way to blend it in to the rest of the photo. So I like to use linear gradients quite often in my skies, and this is something I go into depth about in the course that I mentioned earlier. But what I want to do here is go into the Adjustments tab. I want to slightly darken the sky. So that linear gradient is just giving me a little bit darker. And again, because it's a gradient, it's going to fade into the photo. So I'm not getting too much darkness around my subject, which is the building in the distance here. And while I'm at it, I'm going to add a tint of about a 5 because I want to go ahead and get that tint there because I added some tint to the foreground. And here I'm going to add a little bit of vibrance, like a 7 or 8, just something kind of minor, just a little bit of a pop in color. But if you look at the before and the after, that continual focus on light, containing it with the mask and using Develop gives me amazing control over all aspects of what I want to do. And that's why that's an important tip for me. And that is something, like I said, that I'll talk about a lot in the course. Now, the next thing I want to do is use Accent AI, which is here in Enhance AI. And this is tip number 4. And that is, I love to use Accent AI. And in this case, I got to check my notes. I go to about a 30. The thing is, Accent AI does so many things to a photo around light and contrast and color and all those kind of things. I like to contain it with a mask. Another thing I talk about in my masking course, and that is using Accent AI and being able to control it instead of having it kind of run rampant, for lack of a better word, all across my image. I want to make sure that I contain it and control it by using a mask. And so that's something that I do quite a bit, and I think a radial mask is really good at doing the kind of thing that I want to do with Accent AI here, which is really kind of keep it in that part of the photo. So if I go back to the adjustments and show you the before and after, there's the before and there's the after. It's just a minor little pop. I mean, it is 30, so maybe that's not quite minor, but just a nice little pop, but in that area. And if I apply it across the entire photo, it just has too much of an impact on the colors in the sky and the saturation and everything, but containing it right there gives me a nice little bit of additional visibility and a nice little pop. So again, before and after. And one of the key things about it is containing it with that radial mask, because again, if you look at a radial, it is called a radial gradient. I've got that gradient zone, which I love. And again, I talk about that a lot in this course, where you can blend with that gradient zone and get a nice blend of your edit into the rest of the image without having an abrupt stop or even a line where you can see the difference between where the edit applies and where the edit doesn't apply. So now I've done that. I'm going to get a little bit of color, and I'm going to go ahead and do this globally across the entire image. And that is a 25 in the highlights on toning. It gives a nice little pop of warmth across all the highlights, which are fairly present in the photo. Sky, clouds, some water. I just want to give that a nice little pop. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And then tip number 5 is really just to finish off your overall edit with the use of Develop one more time. I like to come back after I've done my whole edit, which includes light, detail, and color. And I didn't really do anything with detail in this photo, but light, detail, and color, I go through those. I do a lot of masking. I do a lot of customization. And I'll often come at the end of an edit and just say, you know what? I just kind of want to hit it, for lack of a better term, just subtly with Develop. And I use Develop all the time. It is my #1 tool in Luminar, but it's because it has so many possibilities for helping you edit and get the edit that you want. So I'm going to pull Smart Contrast to the right, give that a little bit of a bump. I'm going to drop the highlights just a little bit. I'm going to lift the shadows just a little bit. And I actually just also want to drop the temperature slightly, like about a -10 or 12. And I'm going to bump up the tint just a little bit as well. All I'm doing is a slight temperature and tint change. So shifting slightly the overall color look of the image, but also I've just massaged the tones one more time, but this time globally at the end of my edit. So I took the photo from there to there. It's not a massive difference, but if you add these up, stacking all these different edits, global edits with develop and then super contrast, some custom edits with develop and accent AI, and then a couple of global touches for toning, for color, and again with develop at the end, you really end up having a massive, massive difference in your raw files. So that's the before and after. And honestly, it's a pretty significant difference. And it really comes down to taking control, making a plan, taking advantage of these 5 tips I just shared. It's a great approach to editing. It's one that I use quite a bit. I know it'll help you as well. So thanks for watching. Like I said, if you want to learn about my masking course, it's coming really soon. I'm like this close. I'm almost done. I can't wait to release it. Anyway, if you want to learn about that, check it out by joining my newsletter down below. And I'll see you guys soon. You guys take care. Thanks for watching. Until next time. Adios.